Go home, Jake. I'm doing you a favor. Come on, Jake.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
Friday, February 13th, 2026, and welcome back to Goodfellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining history, economics, and geopolitics. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a Hoover Distinguished Policy Fellow, and I'll be your moderator today. Looking forward to a conversation featuring three of my colleagues we refer to as the Goodfellows. That would, of course, be the historian Sir Neil Ferguson, the economist John Cochrane, and the historian, geostrategist, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. Neil, John, and H.R. are Hoover Senior Fellows. Guys, good to see you. Do we have any triskaidekaphobiacs in the crowd here? Is anybody here afraid of the number 13? I take that as a no. 2026 is a strange year, by the way. Friday the 13th coming up for you this year. Two segments today, gentlemen. In the B block, we'll get into all sorts of various things, including one columnist assertion that Donald Trump has, quote, lost the country. And also want to get the historian's thoughts on one Grammy Award winner's thoughts that we all live on stolen land. But first, we're going to turn our attention to China. Joining us today is returning to Goodfellows is our colleague Frank Dikötter. Frank Dikötter is the Milius Senior Fellow here at the Hoover Institution and Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. He is the most widely read living historian on modern China. You can add to that collection Frank's latest book, which comes out later this month. It's titled Red Dawn Over China, How Communism Conquered a Quarter of Humanity. Frank, welcome back to Goodfellows.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into your book, which really is terrific, Frank, last time we had you on the show, you were new to California, having just moved here from Hong Kong. You've now had about a year to acclimate. Are you a Californian now?
I am getting there. I'm definitely enjoying the perpetual sunshine. It's very hard to believe that you could find a place like this anywhere in Europe. So yes, I'm getting there.
Good to hear, Frank. So let's talk about the book. Congratulations again on it. I really like the way that you laid out the better part of 30 years of history of the Chinese Communist Party, and our viewers should know that Frank's book covers the years 1921 to 1949. My question for you, Frank, here in this country, 250th anniversary of America coming up, kids are having long conversations in school about the founding of the Republic and what the United States is. Let's look at it from the Chinese perspective in terms of how the Chinese teach their kids about the rise of the party and the creation of the modern country. Do they teach it the same way you write in your book? Do they take 30 years and chop it up into little bits and pieces, or do they give a greater arc of history?
Well, of course, there are textbooks written in the PRC and beyond that will go into this entire period in great detail. But the overarching story is quite straightforward. There is a Manchu empire called the Qing. They are corrupt, assaulted by imperialist powers. The empire collapses in 1911. Warlords appear who fight each other, oppress the population. It causes peasant immiseration. There is a fascist dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek that appears in the 1920s and 30s. And thank the sweet Lord, or rather, thank Karl Marx, Lenin, and Stalin for the appearance of the Communist Party. These are the true pioneers in tune with the more progressive spirit. They are the ones who fight for freedom in the hills. And their message of liberation finds great resonance among hundreds of millions of poor peasants who very much rally behind the party and propel it to power in 1949 when the red flag goes up over the Forbidden City. That's the standard account. You will find variations of it abroad. Unfortunately, a great many elements of this sort of tale of a David and Goliath, with the sympathy going to the boy with the sling. You can find it abroad as well.
And if those students, Frank, were to read your book and read an unvarnished history of China, what would they learn?
Well, my problem would not be so much students in the People's Republic of China. They have learned that one should query a great many of these official accounts. My problem really is the readers of modern history abroad, not least in Europe and this country. So the book is difficult for an objective and a subjective reason. The book is difficult because it is true that the period from 1911 to 1949 is referred to as the Republican era. China becomes a republic, the first one in Asia, by the way, is extraordinarily complex, with a capital that changes several times, different parties vying for power, intervention of great powers, an extraterritorial system, alliances between communists and nationalists that are built and fail. It is complex, endless names of generals who fight each other. So that's an objective difficulty. Now, the subjective difficulty is that this abroad has also been simplified into this romantic tale where thank God for the communists who really know how to do something about these dire conditions in the countryside, not to mention cities, and liberate the country. So the objective difficulty lends readers to embrace a very simplistic tale of liberation, which unfortunately doesn't correspond to any of the evidence you can find within the archives of the party itself, within the documents written by the Comintern, the Communist International, which was behind the Communist Party pretty much from day one, 1921, July, when the party is established, or elsewhere.
Frank, I think you're being too hard on yourself, because I didn't think the book was difficult at all, actually. I found it gripping, and I saw three big themes that kind of impelled me to keep reading. The first one is just the sheer unlikeliness of Mao Zedong's ultimate triumph. You show again and again how few people there were at his side, that the numbers are just ludicrously small, especially considering the size of China's population in the 1930s and 1940s. So it seems even less likely that the Bolsheviks than the Bolsheviks' success in Russia. So that was the first thing. It's just such an extraordinary story and so implausible that he finally prevails. The second big theme is Stalin's role in his success, and I think I hadn't fully understood the extent to which the Chinese Revolution ends up being a kind of Soviet operation, the way the Russian Revolution had been a German military operation. And then the most extraordinary thing that you teach us is the enormous difference between the way Mao portrays the Chinese countryside, the peasants' revolution that he supposedly leads, and the reality of life in rural China. And that's to me the really fascinating part of this book. You realize that the whole template that Mao brings from Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism doesn't fit China at all. And indeed, the only way that Mao's communists can come to power is by just a relentless campaign of violence against the very people that they claim to represent. So I think the book is one of your most brilliant. It's utterly gripping, but it also completely recasts our understanding of the rise of Mao's communist revolution.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I can tell that the difficulty is that there is such an ingrained notion of a social revolution in China. It's so common and widespread. The belief that there must have been origins to the revolution, that there must have been social reasons why the Communist Party managed to gain power. That's really the huge sort of stereotype I'm fighting against. And the core of it is, of course, the belief that there is something referred to as land reform. Now, it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about the 1920s or 30s or 40s. The idea is that the communists implemented land reform in a desperately poor countryside, and as a result gained the support of the what I refer to as villagers, but most writers refer to as peasants, not to mention peasantry, all rather unpleasant terms. This is not a feudal country. So first point to be made is that this is a country the size of Europe. When the good old chairman, Mao, says 5% of people in the countryside are landlords, he knows nothing about it. It varies enormously from the north, where land ownership is pretty much equal, to the south, where you have, very powerful clans and lineages that very jealously safeguard their interests against other clans and villages. It's a huge variation. And point two is that throughout from roughly the 1880s till the 1930s, the economic conditions improve. But even if we were to agree, and I think everybody agrees on that the conditions in the countryside vary and are not ideal, far from it, there's an underclass of people, drifters, those Mao himself refers to as riffraff. There's unemployment, there's exploitation. This is a system that has to be changed. And needless to say, a great many people do want to improve the conditions in the countryside, but land reform is not the answer. So what is land reform? It's very, very interesting, because that's the core of the myth. So it comes from the Soviet Union. You have an aristocracy landed. You have serfs who are emancipated, the 1860s, 1870s. Enormous disparities there. But so the idea is, if you take land from the rich, landlords, you give it to the poor, you create a surplus, the surplus will feed the Communist Party. There are no landlords in China. That's the key problem. There's not enough land to be taken from squires or barons or landlords in China to be distributed to the poor. So these land ownership patterns vary enormously, but simply isn't there. So what happens is that the communists only ever manage to establish themselves in very inhospitable land, where the villagers are already very poor, barely able to survive. And now, with the arrival of the communists, they have to feed not just themselves, but also the soldiers and leaders of the Communist Party. What is it that the Communist Party does? It wants to take land from those it refers to as landlords. There are none. Then it takes the land from those it refers to as rich peasants. There are very few. Then it takes the land from those it refers to as middle peasants, which is a great many. Then it goes on and on to the extent that towards the end, everybody has become pretty much a serf. Everybody has been reduced to bonded servitude. Why is that? Because the Communist Party is a war machine. It always needs more grain. It always needs more cannon fodder. There's a point where the local economy just collapses. They have, in effect, in the words of one of the communist leaders, Zhang Guotao, they have squeezed it like a lemon, and then they have to move on. They have to move on to greener pastures, and this sort of pattern repeats itself time and again. So no wonder that so few of the villagers, including the poor ones, are actually keen on joining the Communist Part of China. There's a remarkable document where in the 1930s, one of the leaders in a Soviet that these communists have established in the mountainous area say, the villagers have become lazy. Why does he say it? Because in fact, every cultivator realizes that the majority of what they produce will be confiscated by the party. So why do anything? Why produce more than what you need to feed yourself? That's the myth, land reform.
Hey, Frank, I'll tell you, I love this latest volume. I love the whole body of your work. I want to ask you like a quick, easy question first, which is, how should readers read your body of work? Should we start with Mao's Great Famine and then read them in the order in which you've written these volumes? Or do you think now they should just read chronologically and read this latest book first?
The latest one, in my opinion, is the toughest one. we can all relate to Mao's Great Famine, the famine in which tens of millions were starved, beaten, neglected to death from 1958 to 62. We can all agree that that was a horrendous episode. But this one is so challenging. I would probably read them backwards. If I were me, I'd probably start.
So go to China after Mao first.
I would read that one first.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book too. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great way to approach it. And I think our readers, if you're looking for a summer project, get the whole set and do as Frank has recommended.
And then, of course, the interesting thing is you could skip anything in between and then jump from China after Mao, which is really the 40 years of so-called reform and opening up, brings you all the way up to Xi Jinping. Now you could read this particular volume and still see all the continuities. It seems like a different planet. You know, a bunch of real communist guerrilla fighters, a ragtag army plundering the countryside, and then this great superpower. You think these are two utterly different entities, yet underneath so many similarities, There is, the constant paranoia and conviction that the Communist Party is being surrounded by the imperialists who are out to get them. There is the extraordinary sort of willingness to make promises and pledges which are broken the moment these pledges are no longer convenient. There is the rhetoric about a new democracy in 1940 when Mao promises protection of private property, opposition parties, freedom of speech, and in the meantime is purging his own the ranks of his own party with thousands being executed from 42 to 44. Very much the same today. There is this sort of Orwellian doublespeak. New democracy, 1940, and now, of course, you have the People's Democratic Dictatorship. I mean, remember Orwell, war is peace. Here we have it, peaceful liberation. And then, of course, the purges. We've just seen how the Central Military Commission has been reduced from 7 chaps to 2. And one of the 2 is Mr. Xi Jinping himself. You could not get closer to what happens in Yan'an, the wartime capital of Chairman Mao in 1942-43. Could not get closer to it.
And we should come back to the historical pedagogy question that HR brought up. Do you read history front to back, back to front, or all the way in between? I kind of like all the way in between. Let me ask Frank a question. This is absolutely wonderful. And shaking the founding myth of a nation in a dictatorship is going to cause you some kerfuffle, I'm sure.
Well,
I'm struck, as Neil said, by the incredible contingency of it, by the ever-shifting alliances. First Mao supported by the Russians, and then we're together against the Chinese, and then we join up with the nationalists, and then back again, and so forth. How does a mild-mannered library assistant wind up the greatest dictator of all time? How in the world do they win in the end? And I think the picture you pointed is absolute ruthlessness and incredible violence, both internal and external. They were simply willing to do more in the quest of power and internal power than everybody else was. We mentioned lying, cheating, and stealing, but killing and devastating, it doesn't matter, whatever it takes. And one little note you made really struck me. As the Civil War is going on, no refugees are ever going to the communist side. They're always running the other way. That speaks volumes. But how, as military history, how do you start a ragtag little band and then you conquer China? It seems to be just the willingness to be more ridiculously violent than anyone else.
Yeah. So I would say all the way 1920s, 30s, in fact, till 1940, this party barely exists. We're talking about 50 people in 1921 at the foundation of the party. 1923, when they go into a united front with Sun Yat-sen and the nationalists, maybe hundreds. By 1936, right bang in the middle of the 1930s, there are about 40,000 people who follow the communists. in a country of 500,000,000. By 1940, there's about, if you believe the inflated statistics of the Comintern, about 1 out of every 1,700 people in that huge country is a communist, which is roughly the same number as Communist Party members in the United States of America. At the time, the United States not being, seen as a great leader of the communist revolution. So in fact, in Europe, pretty much anywhere except possibly for Nazi Germany, there are more communists as a proportion of the overall population. So that changes in the 1940s when the Japanese, in effect, do something the communists couldn't do, which from 37 onwards, to be fair, the Japanese defeat the central government. But the key point is 1945. Students ask me, how come China became communist? My answer is, how come Poland became communist? How come Eastern Germany became communist? It's because they were invaded by the Red Army in 1945. And Manchuria, the size of France and Japan, to the north of Beijing, extraordinarily rich in resources, strategic gateway to the rest of the country. That's where the Manchus came when they invaded in 1644. 1,000,000 soldiers from the Soviet Union invade Manchuria in the summer of 1945, and they stay there, and they hand over the countryside to Chairman Mao and the communists. And that's the key point where all of a sudden that balance of power becomes to change. And then what you say is absolutely crucial. They are lost in the 1920s and 30s, but once they are backed by the Soviet Union with weapons arriving by the trainload from North Korea, of course, but also from Siberia, with officers being trained in Moscow, with military institutions established throughout Manchuria, then the kind of warfare they practice, I refer to as unrestricted warfare. And it means that you are just more determined than your enemy. So that includes using villages as shields. It includes barrier troops, putting soldiers behind the soldiers in front of you so that at least they have a chance of survival. If they move forward, if they turn back, they get shot. But most of all, the horrendous willingness of starving entire cities into surrender. So this happens in 1948, Changchun, big city right bang in the middle of Manchuria. It is starved, surrounded by PLA, Red Army communist soldiers by Lin Biao, trenches 4 meters deep, sentries all around it. Nobody's allowed to leave or enter that city. 160,000 civilians starved to death over a period of 8 months. The same number of victims endured in Hiroshima after the dropping of the bomb. So once that city collapses, if you were in charge of Beijing, if you're the man having to defend Beijing, would you be willing to fight? So one by one, these cities, they topple like dominoes. You just can't fight this machine. Of course, this is exactly what the Americans find out a couple of years later during the Korean War.
Frank, our time is winding down with you. I'd like to get your thoughts on two topics related to China, the China of 2026.
Yes.
One is geopolitical, the other, John, is economic. First, let's start with the geopolitics. Frank, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump recently had a phone call in which reportedly Xi said Taiwan is, quote, the most important issue in China-U.S. relations, and Xi also said, quote, China will, quote, never allow Taiwan to be separated from China. That was what was reported. Frank, you have called China a paper tiger militarily. Are you still standing by that?
Not quite a paper tiger. So here's the link, if you wish, with pre-49. Mm-hmm. It's a somewhat worrying one. The tactics are great, but the strategy is poor. So what are the tactics? The tactics are that you throw vast numbers of people at your enemy. This is what happens during the Civil War, 1945-49. And we have seen a similar attempt with this thousands of boats, civilian boats, outside Taiwan to somehow train for a possible blockade. So that really is the challenge. If you look at the aircraft carriers, what? The last one, the third one, with its oil boilers, incapable of having planes land and take off at the same time. Not exactly a great technological innovation. Of course, the talk is always about the next aircraft carrier. Well, we shall see. It's not a nuclear one. Not to mention submarines. That's not the issue. The issue is that this country could potentially mobilize so many people, so many boats, and throw so much at it without regard for casualties. That's the problem of great tactics and poor strategy, is that it comes at an enormous cost. So that is very, very, very worrisome. But as I also said, what is the capacity of the man in charge to actually get the army to follow his orders, and what is the willingness of soldiers on the ground to actually go in there and fight? They had great difficulties in 1989 fighting their own citizens. An entire army was turned back when it first tried to crush the demonstrators on Tiananmen Square. This was not June. This was 6 weeks earlier. So I'm not so sure that Xi Jinping all he has to do is press a button and we have a blockade or an invasion of Taiwan. I would say what has happened with the sacking or the purge of Zhang Youxia and others is that my best guess is that these military know quite well how extraordinarily difficult it would be, and Xi Jinping is not really willing to listen.
Hey, Frank, going back to the theme that understanding China and the Chinese Communist Party today does really have its roots back in the Civil War. There are two related questions I want to ask you. Why, despite the brutality of the CCP, do people still not get it? How brutal the party is? And as a result, make arguments like, hey, the Chinese people are culturally predisposed toward not wanting a say in how they're governed. They actually need to be governed, by a party who employs the kind of tactics that they're using to extinguish human freedom. And the party is able to cultivate voices not only within China that put forward that argument, but internationally. How is the party able to accomplish that? And are there parallels back to that Civil War period as Mao is murdering such large numbers of his own people?
Yes. So first of all, you have useful idiots like Edgar Snow, Red Star over China, book published in 1937, that portrays them not so much as communists, but great agrarian reformers who are there to bring freedom and liberty to a nation in despair. And of course, Mao cultivates that image in Yan'an, wartime capital of the communists during the Second World War, with really a Potemkin village where you have American journalists and come and see model schools, model prisons, model farms, and go back and chant it. But the real answer to your question is that the people in China know exactly how brutal the Communist Party is. They know exactly. You don't have to explain to them. It is us, Westerners, possibly Japanese as well, who make a fatal mistake. And I think that mistake is quite straightforward. When we talk about Chinese communism, a great many of us simply do not believe that it is real communism. In other words, when we talk about communist China and the communists, we think of culture, Chinese culture. We don't think of communist politics. That's the key mistake. That mistake was made by the Americans during the Second World War, when the Chinese Mao describes as agrarian reformers, made again by Kissinger and Nixon, when they're described as a sort of Confucian world, and again, of course, by Clinton. So all along, this confusion that Chinese communists are not real communists, that there's basically Democrats waiting to emerge.
Now, Frank, the economic side of things, two stories out. One, Xi reportedly wants to challenge the U.S. dollar for world dominance. He wants, quote, a powerful central bank in China and a more resilient international currency. Couple that with a Wall Street Journal headline, the American and Chinese economies are hurtling toward a messy divorce. Your thoughts, Frank?
Well, great. I'm sure that Xi Jinping would like to de-dollarize and have the renminbi or the yuan become international currency. But at this point in time, it represents 2% of all international exchanges. The key point really is that we're dealing with a Marxist economy, meaning that there are constraints, capital controls on the renminbi. It cannot be freely exchanged. And as long as that remains the case, there will be no true challenge to the dollar or other currencies. I simply don't see it. And why will these capital constraints not be lifted? For the very simple reason that they need to fix the exchange rate in order to be able to keep on exporting the vast amounts that they do at this point in time. They've controlled the exchange rate pretty much from day one, and are not about to give it up.
Let me chime in on that one. Fixed exchange rate isn't necessarily terrible, but absolutely has to be freely convertible, and it has to be totally trustworthy. If you hold the Chinese bond, you know you're going to get paid back. It's not going to be defaulted. It's not going to be taxed away. It's not going to be inflated away. There's an opening there. The U.S. isn't so trustworthy, but China isn't ready to fill that opening. The second thing you mentioned, though, China depends on exports and it depends on imports. They also have their own problems. So a blockade, a war in Taiwan would shut down trade and would probably be fairly catastrophic for the Chinese as well, no?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. This is what I've always said, that they can blockade Taiwan, but they're really blockading themselves. That they depend to an unusual extent on imports of oil, petrol, grain. The list is pretty long. Now, of course, they have been trying for decades now. This started with Jiang Zemin, the so-called Go West campaign, which is to open up Xinjiang province, cultivate it, and of course have oil pipes go through Xinjiang all the way to the rest of Asia. But that is not enough. So a blockade would be extremely difficult to sustain, not so much by Taiwan, but by the People's Republic of China.
So following up, I think some of what they're trying to do with the currency is to have not a global currency that everybody likes, but a break glass in case of emergency way to pay for things that get around sanctions. And the other question is, when the Great Blockade comes, the U.S. calls up Canada, Latin America, Europe, and says, hey, we need you all to help us here on the financial and economic sanctions. Do they say, okay, we'll give up all the great cheap stuff we're getting from China? Or do they say, oh, you, the U.S., how lovely to hear from you again. We were last talking about tariffs.
Well, yes and no, but, as Sakae Takeichi made so clear, is very, eloquent. Any blockade of Taiwan is a direct threat to the national security of Japan. So it will not just be a sort of PRC Taiwan issue. It will be an issue for every country in that region. And I can't.
Which is why we care.
This indeed. I simply cannot see the PRC as a power that is surrounded by friendly allies.
But I think, as Neil's beautiful First World War illustrates, governments are able to ignore the economic catastrophe that will follow from an invasion. Sorry, Neil, go ahead.
Frank, can I just throw in a plug for Ike Fryman's forthcoming book, Defending Taiwan, in which he argues that China's been furiously trying to reduce its exposure to trade sanctions and a blockade. It's stockpiling immense quantities of oil and grain. It's buying gold like crazy. John will have noticed the price action in the gold market. And so compared with 10 or 20 years ago, I think China's much less vulnerable to the kind of economic measures that we're talking about. I agree with much that you say. In fact, I wholly agree with your points about China's military leadership. But one can't ignore the speed of rearmament or armament under Xi Jinping, the incredible build-up of weaponry in every domain, not only surface ships, you mentioned submarines, but also missiles, including hypersonic missiles that could take out US communications in Guam. So I think it's really important to recognize not only the weaknesses of the regime, and this is part of the point of your new book, but also the ruthlessness that animates it. And that's a especially important when we know that Xi Jinping, in a sense, has a Mao complex.
Yes.
And I wanted to get your thought on this. There's a sense in which the man is trying to somehow emulate Mao. There's a personality cult, unlike anything we've seen since Mao in Chinese media. There's a concentration of power in the hands of Xi Jinping, which is, again, remarkable. He has cast term limits aside. And one senses a kind of a thirst to equal Mao by bringing Taiwan under the control of the CCP, the way Hong Kong has been more or less brought under its control. Do you think that that's the right way to think about Xi as somebody, a sort of Mao wannabe who will take great risk and be very ruthless to achieve that goal?
Well, of course, all dictators study each other, and all dictators are want to be whoever is better. So Mao wants to emulate Stalin and possibly go beyond. He thinks Stalin made several mistakes, and one is that he didn't spot his nemesis, Nikita Khrushchev, who of course started de-Stalinization a few years after Stalin dies in 1953. So Stalin is a great example for Mao, but Mao will do better. Pol Pot comes to see Mao, believes he will do better. But Mao tells him, I made a mistake with the cities. They're just bourgeois capitalists. There's little I can do about it, even Shanghai. Pol Pot starts by emptying every single city under the Khmer Rouge. They all want to imitate each other. They all want to be stronger and better and more successful. And success, from the point of view of a dictator, is concentration of power. Now, the other point really is that from 1949 onwards, all of them are determined to take back Taiwan. So Mao is determined. Deng repeatedly says that he will, if necessary, invade Taiwan and take it back. Jiang Zemin is the one who starts sending missiles across the Taiwan Strait, 94, 95. They're not exactly choir boys, but see the difference with Xi Jinping is he's got the clout. This is not the China of the 1980s or 1990s. This country has benefited enormously from its inclusion in the WTO. So the clout, the power that she has at its disposal is far greater. But I think you are right. There's something very short-sighted. You remember I called them caveman Marxists, and Xi Jinping strikes me exactly as that. Unfortunately, the real worrying thing is that he is, in my opinion, not as talented as Mao. He simply isn't as clever as Mao. There's something very obtuse about him. And I think that is manifested in all those purges on the Central Military Commission.
He's also not Brezhnev. The contrast with the late Russians seems very important here.
Yes.
Well, Frank, I think you have to come back on Goodfellows maybe after you've written another book on Xi Jinping, and we can further discuss that. I want to thank you for your time today, sir. You are a great guest. Come back soon on the show. And congratulations again on the book. Its title, for those who didn't catch it at the beginning of the show, Red Dawn Over China, How Communism Conquered a Quarter of Humanity. Frank, congratulations.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, on to the B block. I have 3 items for you. Item number 1, citing poor approval numbers, an electorate in a wrong track mood, policy blunders such as Doge and ICE. New York Times columnist Rouse Douthat claims that Donald Trump has, and I quote, lost the country. Do you agree or disagree? And Neil, why don't you take a crack at this, because you recently wrote about Trump and how he may try to avoid what you call the 6-year itch.
Well, we've been told time and time again that something dreadfully new is happening because Donald Trump is president, the Constitution's in danger, the Republic will celebrate 250 years and then go into liquidation. But guess what? It's politics as usual. We're in the second year of a second term, and the thing that happens to all presidents, certainly since Harry Truman, is happening to Donald Trump. His approval rating is way down, not just generally, but also on all the issues where he's supposed to be strong: the economy, inflation, immigration, where the overreach egged on by Stephen Miller in Minneapolis has completely blown up in the administration's face. And just to add to the sense of historical familiarity, there's a scandal. There's always a scandal. It burnt through Nixon's second term most famously, but let's not forget Iran-Contra, which blew up at the end of the second year of Ronald Reagan's second term, and of course Lewinsky, who completely or very nearly derailed Bill Clinton's second year of his second term. So I've definitely seen this movie before, and it tends to end nearly always, not always, but nearly always, with the president's party doing really badly in the midterms, and they're certainly on course to lose the House the way things are going, though I think they just hang on to the Senate because the map's a favorable one this year.
Yeah, a word of caution, pay more attention to the president's approval numbers than the wrong track number. In 2012, the country was in a 55% wrong track move, but it still reelected Barack Obama. But HR, John, you have thoughts on this?
I guess my thought is, it seems like President Trump is not missing too many opportunities to surrender the high ground on issues. I mean, so he came in, he's disrupting a lot of what needs to be disrupted. And of course, he had some real claims that, hey, the Justice Department had been weaponized against him and he had been treated unfairly. But then to engage in similar activity to settle scores, I mean, he loses the high ground. On the military, hey, great argument, that the Biden administration is pushing this radical social agenda on the military, politicizing the military. Great argument that those 6 congressmen and senators, with that BS video, in my view, saying, hey, don't follow illegal orders. He had the high ground. And then he surrenders it, by prosecuting a sitting senator and maybe suggesting that he could be punished by death. I mean, come on. You've got the high ground on being a champion for sovereignty, whether it's vis-a-vis the Panamanian Canal or Greenland, and then strengthening ties with allies after he got them to spend more in defense, right? And now, what a great opportunity to come together, as John was mentioning in the conversation with Frank, to confront Chinese economic aggression, for example. And then you gratuitously insult, all of your allies, and then they begin to think, well, maybe Xi Jinping's not that bad. So anyway, I just think maybe these numbers reflect, to a certain extent, President Trump's propensity, to take the high ground, which in the military, that's a good thing, man, to have the high ground. But then he surrenders the high ground. And I think maybe people are getting tired of that. I mean, and of course we're talking about, he has the high ground on border security and so forth. And then Minneapolis, the images there, the conduct there. I mean, you surrender the high ground.
John, quickly your thought.
Time of great volatility means who knows, really. Trump needs a couple of nice victories and a couple of don't shoot yourself in the foot. And we've seen both victories and shooting.
Don't give up the high ground, John. Don't give it up.
Exactly. Of this latest news cycle, I think Trump made big inroads with Latinos, but the news that they're getting picked up randomly on the street because they don't look right is, I think, that's really damaging to that corner of the electorate. But there'll be 15 news cycles between now and the elections, and if they can just win a couple of them, it's very hard to say exactly which way we'll go. And there's lots of great stuff going on under the radar screen, but maybe they could bring it back up. Like, I'll just highlight today's reversing the EPA's endangerment finding for carbon dioxide. That's just a huge positive for the economy. I don't think that's going to go anywhere in the polling and in the elections, and it's not going to have its effect within the year. But that kind of stuff is going on.
Let's stick with economics, John, for a second. And by the way, inflation now today, 2.4%. John, New York Times recently cautioned, quote, the global economy signals are broken, adding, quote, from markets to spending to debt, usually reliable indicators that forecast where the economy is headed are proving deeply fallible. Okay, John, and what indicators do we trust?
We don't. Don't try to forecast the economy is a fool's errand. In part because most of what happens is the external shocks. It's not the internal dynamics working themselves out. So you can forecast to some extent, but don't believe in indicators. Believe in, I think Neil will tell us, the contingency of history. And boy, in the age of Trump, is there ever contingency of history?
Neil?
Very interesting moment economically, because if you just look at the data for US performance, Trump ought to be riding high.
Yeah.
By the standards of pretty much every presidency in my lifetime, this is going great. and it's going great mainly because of this extraordinary capex boom being propelled forward by investment in artificial intelligence. But there's also all kinds of job creation in sectors that don't really attract so much attention. Nearly all the jobs seem to be getting created in healthcare, which I guess tells us that we're an aging population and need a lot of healthcare. But the strength of the economy doesn't translate into popularity for the administration right now in ways that are interesting. That voters complain about affordability, which is a completely different concept from inflation as the Fed defines it. The public kind of wants prices to go down. That's not part of the Fed's plan. I'll add one other point. I mean, I do think there's a lot of volatility in some parts of financial markets that might be signaling we're nearing the top. All the kind of price action around silver we've seen, the volatility in tech stocks and software stocks particularly. I mean, I'm getting an uneasy feeling that this capex boom is nearing its peak because people are starting to ask the question, we've discussed this before, hey, we're spending like trillions on all these data centers, but the amount of money we're projecting to make, the revenue over the next 5 years is like 1 trillion less than all we're spending on the capex. Somebody's going to be left holding a $1 trillion bag, and I suspect the scramble to avoid holding that bag is soon to be upon us.
And the software companies are already starting to go down. So we can start seeing, we're at a moment of fragility, that's for sure.
All right, gentlemen, our final item, it's related to California, which is fitting since this is the Rare Goodfellas, where all of you are in California, or at least in California until Neil hops a plane soon for parts unknown. So let's talk about a little California brand ditziness. Pop sensation Billie Eilish, the winner of the Song of the Year at this year's Grammy Awards, took the stage and made it an opportunity to denounce not only ICE raids, but also added, and I quote,
"No one is illegal on stolen land."
Neil?
But I think anybody who engages in this kind of rhetoric should be obliged to surrender any real estate that they own themselves to whoever they think the rightful owners are. This has become a kind of leftist cult. The land acknowledgement is now mandatory at almost any public event in Canada or New Zealand. It's creeping in the United States. I'm heading to Montana. I remember coming across graffiti not so long ago insisting that I was skiing on stolen land. It's all very silly indeed. Because when North America was being settled, nearly all of land was uncultivated. And the great philosopher John Locke made the argument that it was terra nullius, that this land didn't have property rights in it until it had been cultivated. And that was a basis for the way in which North and indeed South America were settled. So you can take the decision retrospectively that the land you're living on was stolen from someone, but that's on you. It's certainly not based in any understanding of American law. So yeah, Billy, hand it over. You can hand it over to anyone you like, but if you're not prepared to hand over the real estate you own, then shut the heck up.
John, I had a flashback to grade school, and we all had to sing "This Land Is Your Land."
I had a great introduction to this. I was at the Bank of New Zealand, and the land acknowledgement was delivered in Maori, so at least get the language right. Our Cooper colleague Terry Anderson, who actually is a student of Native American history, once delivered a wonderful land acknowledgement because he knew the history of it, and he acknowledged the tribe who used to own that land, and the tribe before then that Tribe A had murdered, slaughtered, raped, and killed and kicked out. And then he had 4 tribes back because this is what human history has been for, hundreds of thousands of years. And as a true descendant of Englishmen, I want to complain about those darn Danes and what were they doing coming into my to my ancestral home of York and stealing our
Hey, sure, I'm going to give you the last word. So you're down in Newport Beach, and weather permitting, you're going to go paddleboarding at some point. Question, my friend, do you live on stolen land and do you paddle on stolen water?
Hey, I would just say try to find a nation that is not founded in some way by conquest, migration, colonization, right? So no, it is just a ridiculous argument that you just don't enforce your borders, because of some kind of pre-ownership. It's it's ludicrous.
We should close on this. What happened to the native populations in America was a tragedy. Millions of people died, not of war, but largely of disease. Populations cut down to the 5%. I don't think saying something performative at a Hollywood event does anything to acknowledge that it was a tragedy. It's not a morality play. That's what happened. And a quick shout out here to Charles Mann's wonderful book, 1491, which tells you what America looked like before contact with Europeans and smallpox.
All right, gentlemen, good conversation. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. It's a show our viewers don't want to miss because our guest will be Kemi Badenoch. She is the leader of the Conservative Party in Great Britain. Finally, someone Neil could talk to with an accent he'll understand. So we'll get in all sorts of things about UK politics. I'm very fascinated about the pair.
No, he's Scottish. He won't be able to.
You want to
understand you. I could just about understand you, Bill, but you're stumbling over your words so much. I'm not sure English is your first language.
Yeah, it's early in the morning for me, my friend. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Goodfellows. On behalf of my colleagues, Sir Neil Ferguson, H.R. McMaster, John Cochran, all of us here at the Hoover Institution, we hope you enjoyed the show. We'll see you back soon. Till next time, take care.
This land is your land, and this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.